Celestine Tobido had entered the darkest period of her life without ever realizing the depths that horror could reach. Nights became a torment from which no sleep offered respite. Her dreams were no longer simple disturbances of the mind. They were vivid, unrelenting visions of her unborn children being paraded and sold at auction. Invisible barriers trapped her in place, and no plea, no struggle, no desperate reach could change the outcome. Each night she awoke in sweat-soaked sheets, her body trembling, her stomach tied in knots of nausea so severe she could not keep food down for days. Her head pounded as if iron spikes were being driven through her skull, each pulse a reminder that the forces at work were beyond the understanding of human medicine. As the pregnancy progressed, her body betrayed her with swelling and fluid retention that made every breath laborious and movement agonizing. Her abdomen expanded unnaturally, yet the child within seemed to resist the ordinary vitality of life. Kicks were irregular, weak, and fleeting. It was as if something, a presence, a malevolence, had lodged itself alongside her child, cold and unyielding, a force that defied biology yet confirmed the success of the spiritual channels that Braguet had begun to manipulate. This was no ordinary sickness or complication. Celestine could feel the weight of ancestral forces converging on her, drawing her womb into a cruel rhythm of cosmic justice. Braguet, the healer who had tended her during past pregnancies, now worked in ways that were no longer simple caregiving. Her hands remained gentle, her knowledge of herbs extensive, and to the physicians who occasionally observed her, she appeared a model of natural skill. Yet those trained to see beyond the veil could recognize the true purpose of her interventions. Every poultice, every remedy contained both relief and an invisible poison. Every moment of seeming improvement masked a deeper decline, orchestrated according to laws that measured justice rather than health. Braguet's hands were instruments of a plan that would ensure the Tobido family would feel the loss of something precious, something that money, influence, and social standing could never prevent. The stages of Celestine's pregnancy became increasingly ominous. Her skin stretched, her body ached, and yet her child's growth lagged behind, as if life itself was struggling against an unseen gravity. At times, Celestine felt another presence moving within her, cold, hostile, fundamentally wrong. The sensations were unmistakable, spiritual in origin, and they confirmed that Braguet's work was succeeding. Cosmic debt was being collected through the very body of the mother, through channels that human hands could not touch. When the time came in March of 1853, labor descended upon her like a tempest. 48 hours of agony pushed Celestine to the edge of endurance. The baby emerged, baptized Jean-Baptiste Jr., only to die shortly after, in a manner no white physician could explain or prevent. The cries that echoed through Belle Reverend that night were answered only by Braguet's cold, satisfied gaze from the doorway. Bacalaire's spirit had claimed another Tobido soul, demonstrating that ancestral justice operated independently of earthly wealth or law. This was only the second payment on a generational debt, but it established a pattern that would shadow every future pregnancy, every birth, and every member of the family. The spiritual mechanics of Braguet's curse now linked her will to the Tobido bloodline. Each child yet to be born would enter the world under siege, every life contested by the spirits of those stolen from Belrev. Every pregnancy was now a battlefield between ancestral justice and human expectation. Every child was destined to encounter forces that measured suffering rather than lineage. As Braguet's transformation into the Mourning Priestess reached its terrifying potential. Outside the walls of Belrev, life continued in ignorance, but within the plantation, shadows lengthened, and the air itself seemed heavy with premonitions. Celestine's body reflected the invisible assault, exhaustion, swelling, and a growing sense that her own womb was no longer solely her domain. Braguet's interventions created relief that was only temporary, masking a deeper decline, and demonstrating that cosmic forces obeyed laws far older and far less forgiving than any mortal authority. By the time Jean-Baptiste Jr. died, the pattern was clear. Celestine was caught in a spiral of grief and bodily trauma that served a larger purpose than individual suffering. Braguet had shifted from healer to instrument of cosmic justice, orchestrating the downfall of the Tobido family one generation at a time. Each intervention, each remedy, each moment of apparent reprieve was a thread in a web of spiritual warfare that would bind the family line until no descendant remained untouched by loss. Celestine's suffering was not an accident. It was a manifestation of laws older than Louisiana, older than the plantations themselves. rooted in the balance of life, death, and ancestral memory. In the dim light of her chamber, Celestine clutched her belly, haunted by dreams that mirrored reality. Her body bore the signs of a war waged against her family's legacy. A war fought through her very flesh and blood. The invisible forces were patient, persistent, and purposeful, ensuring that every step of her pregnancy served the will of a justice beyond human comprehension. And as the first child of this cursed sequence passed into death, Braggett's quiet, unyielding satisfaction marked the beginning of a spiritual campaign that would echo across generations, turning grief into weaponry and maternal love into the force that would reshape an entire bloodline. The chill of late autumn in 1854 had settled over Belle Reverend with the persistence of a spectre, wrapping the plantation in a cloak of oppressive silence that seemed to absorb every sound, every movement, until the air itself felt heavy with expectation. The trees along the bayou, skeletal and wind-bent, whispered secrets in a language unintelligible to ordinary ears, carrying messages that only those attuned to spiritual realities could interpret. Braggett moved through the undergrowth with a precision born of years spent translating grief into action, her bare feet brushing mossy roots and fallen leaves without disturbing the patterns of the unseen energies that swirled around her. Each step, each gesture, was both calculated and instinctive, the result of her transformation from grieving mother into something closer to an instrument of cosmic will than a human being. Her eyes, once soft and filled with maternal concern, now glimmered with the cold clarity of someone whose grief had been weaponized, whose sorrow had been forged into a tool capable of reshaping the fates of generations. Celestine's suffering had already transformed her body into a vessel marked by the lingering touch of Braggett's interventions. Though her womb had once been a site of potential life, it had instead become a theater where cosmic justice performed with unyielding rigor. Each failed pregnancy, each infant life extinguished before it could flourish, was a note in a symphony of ancestral reclamation that Braggett conducted with unwavering certainty. Celestine's eyes, now dulled with grief, reflected not only the trauma of her personal loss, but the broader patterns of cruelty inflicted by her family upon those who had no power to resist. And while Braggett's remedies had appeared to offer comfort, they were always dual-edged, temporary relief, masking the inexorable progression of consequences that the Tobido bloodline could not escape. Nausea, weakness, and the chilling sensation of unseen presences moving alongside the unborn had marked Celestine's existence as one defined by the limits of human agency in the face of spiritual law. The plantation's physical landscape mirrored this spiritual decay. The sugarcane fields, once flourishing and proud under the hot Louisiana sun, now struggled against blights that seemed to rise from the soil itself, as though the land had absorbed the pain and rage of generations of enslaved laborers and was now exacting its own form of justice. Livestock, once vital to the plantation's productivity, fell victim to unseen forces, their bodies contorted in death as if they had been wrestling with invisible opponents. Even the air bore traces of the unseen. Cold drafts that chilled without source, faint whispers at night that carried the syllables of languages long suppressed, and occasional glimpses of movement in peripheral vision that left witnesses questioning their sanity. White authorities, rational and determined, could find no cause, no explanation, no connection to the suffering that had mounted like a tide against the foundations of the Tobido legacy. In the plantation house, the effects were even more pronounced. Mirrors, cracked inexplicably, reflected not only images of the living, but fragments of the past, showing fleeting glimpses of children who had been denied life, spirits who had been conscripted into Braggett's growing army of justice. Celestine's own perception, blurred between waking and dreaming, often caught these reflections, and she recoiled from them, recognizing too late the mechanisms of her torment. These children, once promised to the family's lineage, now served as agents of retribution, enforcing a law that transcended human understanding. Every cry, every flicker of shadow, every phantom movement of furniture or plaything reinforced the certainty that Braggett's campaign had moved beyond personal vengeance into the orchestration of universal balance. Master Jean-Baptiste's efforts to preserve his family's legacy became increasingly frantic and futile. Physicians from New Orleans were summoned in vain, their degrees proving worthless against ailments without physical cause. Ministers offered prayers that soothed the mind momentarily, but failed to touch the spiritual wounds that had been opened. Even those versed in African-derived spiritual practices could only identify patterns and powers, not dismantle the intricate web that Braggett had woven. Her interventions were meticulous, informed by centuries of transmitted knowledge, using elements that ordinary observers could neither recognize nor comprehend. White authority, with all its legal and economic machinery, proved powerless against what was both subtle and undeniable, the manifestation of justice enacted through spiritual channels. As October deepened, the nights grew longer, denser with portent. Bragget prepared her most ambitious work in the secluded heart of the Bayou, among cypress groves that had witnessed centuries of oppression and survival. Moonlight filtered through the hanging Spanish moss, casting fractured patterns that aligned with ancestral principles, guiding her ritual. The components, hair, soil, water, fragments of clothing from the Tobido family, were arranged with precision, anchoring her intentions across time and space, ensuring that her curse could reach generations yet unborn. In these acts, Bragget transcended grief. She became a conduit, channeling energies that demanded moral accounting where human systems had consistently failed. When midnight struck, the natural and supernatural world aligned. The bayou's waters glowed unnaturally, the trees swayed as if breathing to the rhythm of some unseen pulse, and the air thickened with ancestral presence. Hundreds of spirits gathered, their energy palpable, their collective will flowing through Bragget as she intoned ancient Yoruba chants. These were not words of supplication, but commands of justice, binding the Tobido bloodline to consequences that would extend beyond mortality. Each syllable, each movement, reinforced the cosmic debt owed by generations of oppressors. Celestine's suffering, while tragic, was but a prelude to a broader orchestration of moral correction, an intimate demonstration of the inescapable reach of spiritual law. By the first light of November 1, the ritual had transformed the landscape, both physical and metaphysical. Belle Rêve's spiritual atmosphere was irreversibly altered. Every future pregnancy among the Tobidos would now be contested by forces beyond human control. Children who survived birth would carry the shadow of ancestral justice, ensuring the cycle of moral reckoning would persist until the debt had been fully repaid. Bragget, having surrendered her personal humanity to become an instrument of cosmic balance, remained at the heart of this transformed world, an unyielding presence whose grief had been reshaped into a mechanism of unrelenting justice. The following months after Bragget's great ritual were marked by an eerie quiet that belied the continuing operations of her spiritual campaign. Belle Rêve, while outwardly still a functioning plantation, seemed to pulse with a rhythm dictated by forces invisible to human comprehension. The enslaved community, those who had survived decades of oppression and now witnessed the subtle manifestations of ancestral intervention, spoke in hushed tones about the ways the land itself seemed to remember every injustice committed upon it. Cornfields that should have flourished during autumn, with the promise of winter provisions, now grew unevenly. Patches of blackened soil interspersed with fragile stalks that appeared incapable of sustaining life. The air carried a density that pressed against the lungs of those walking its paths, a tangible reminder that something beyond the material realm was at work. Celestine, already weakened by a lifetime of reproductive failure and psychological torment, became a silent observer of Belle Rêve's slow decay. Her once luminous violet eyes now reflected a dull haze, the spark of vitality extinguished by the relentless forces that Bragget had set in motion. Though she moved through the halls and grounds of the plantation, her steps were measured, weighed down by the invisible burdens that pressed against her spirit. Each failure of the sugarcane to grow, each sudden illness among the livestock, reinforced the pattern she could not escape. To her, every wisp of wind, every subtle disturbance in the shadows was a reminder that the spiritual war was active, a war she could neither influence nor evade. Jean-Baptiste, meanwhile, descended further into desperation. The collapse of his family's once profitable empire was no longer a matter of market fluctuation, but of inexplicable phenomena that could not be measured or reasoned away. Financiers and plantation advisors provided advice that, though confident in tone, fell flat in utility. He sought the counsel of ministers, physicians, and even folk practitioners, yet none could touch the underlying force that eroded his family's future. Night after night, he was tormented by visions of children, spectral yet insistent, their faces ghostly and sorrowful, their voices whispering in tongues both unfamiliar and deeply understood. Each apparition served as a reminder that wealth and status were powerless in the face of cosmic accounting. Bragget, for her part, operated with the precision of a force of nature. The components of her ritual, soil, hair, water, and clothing of the Tobido bloodline, remained carefully maintained, their arrangement a latticework connecting the living to the dead across generations. She moved among her garden of potent, unnatural plants, cultivating herbs whose properties no conventional pharmacology could explain. The vegetation responded to her intentions, rather than to conventional horticultural care, growing with uncanny vigor in some patches, and wilting in others according to patterns of moral alignment rather than environmental factors. The enslaved women who approached her for healing were taught, subtly and indirectly, to respect the balance she enforced. Assistance was given, but never without the recognition that each act of intervention carried consequences that might not manifest immediately. The children of Belle Reve, those who remained among the enslaved community, reported increasingly vivid dreams. They spoke of spectral playmates who appeared in reflective surfaces, dancing among cypress trees in circles, illuminated by lights that had no earthly origin. Some spoke in the whispers of old African tongues, reciting phrases that they could not have learned in the formal world, phrases that carried authority and power. These dream children became emissaries of justice, conduits for ancestral law, training for the spiritual army that Braggett had conscripted. Their lives, fragile and fleeting in a plantation system designed to crush vitality, now carried dual realities. They were present in the physical realm, but deeply intertwined with forces that demanded moral accountability. By winter, the decline of Belle Reve was unmistakable. The plantation house sagged, its columns cracking under the weight of age, neglect, and spiritual entropy. Each crack, each warped floorboard, seemed to echo the failures of the Tobido lineage, a testament to wealth's impotence against forces larger than human design. Even distant relatives, who had attempted to restore operations, discovered that conventional measures failed catastrophically. Crops withered inexplicably, livestock succumbed without diagnosis, and children showed symptoms no physician could explain. White authority, when confronted with these phenomena, attributed them to superstition, coincidence, or the natural chaos of Southern life. But those attuned to spiritual realities understood. The curse was absolute, unbound by geography or human intention. Celestine's health deteriorated further during these months, and she became a figure of quiet, tragic inevitability. Mirrors were covered, as even fleeting glimpses of the conscripted spirits drove her toward despair. She spoke to these spirits in the twilight hours, conversations that drew the lines between reality and the spectral, between life and death. Her days were marked by sleepless nights, punctuated by episodes in which she could feel the restless energy of Braggett's army of justice passing through the plantation, assessing, enforcing, and perpetuating balance. Though her body was mortal, her mind became a liminal space where grief, memory, and spiritual insight intersected, a silent witness to cosmic law in motion. Braggett's presence remained both visible and ineffably powerful. She moved through the Bayou with a solemnity that seemed to slow time itself, her shadow elongating unnaturally across the Spanish moss, her aura blurring the lines between worlds. Every gesture reinforced her authority over both the physical and metaphysical landscape. She had become more than a healer. She was a conduit, an embodiment of ancestral will, a bridge connecting the wronged of generations past to the reckoning of those who had perpetrated suffering. The Bayou waters shimmered with unseen light. The cypress trees whispered secrets, and the soil itself resonated with her intentions, a living map of cosmic justice being implemented with meticulous care. By the end of this autumn, Belle Reve had become a place where wealth, power, and social position no longer guaranteed safety. The Tobido legacy, once synonymous with dominance, was now synonymous with decay, loss, and spiritual accountability. Every surviving family member faced the consequences of ancestral sins, and the plantation itself, tied to both land and blood, became a monument to the inexorability of justice. The spectral children continued their silent march of enforcement, the living witnesses to cosmic law, and Braggett's transformation from grieving mother to mourning priestess remained complete. She had achieved a reality in which the scales were balanced, yet the consequences would echo across decades, shaping events far beyond her immediate sight. The winter of 1855 settled over Belle Reve with a silence that carried both weight and menace, a season of suspended time, in which the effects of Braggett's ritual grew more tangible to anyone sensitive to spiritual currents. Snow was rare in the Delta, but the mist that rolled in from the bayou brought its own kind of frost, a chill that seemed to seep into bone and soul alike. The enslaved community, hardened by years of toil and tragedy, moved carefully through these days, whispering of lights flickering beneath the cypress canopies, of distant laughter that carried the unmistakable cadence of children's voices, and of fleeting glimpses of forms that were neither fully present nor entirely absent. They understood, better than any outsider, that Bridget's work was not merely a personal vendetta, but a structured system of enforcement, a moral architecture imposed upon the land and the bloodline that had long exploited them. Celestine, weakened and hollowed by repeated miscarriages and ongoing psychological torment, found herself trapped within a cycle that seemed impervious to relief. Her body, frail and swelling from residual effects of her previous pregnancies, became a vessel of persistent grief, a reminder that the human capacity to endure suffering had limits. She moved through the halls of the plantation with deliberate slowness, each step a confrontation with her own mortality, and the relentless proof that cosmic justice had no regard for comfort or human expectation. In her private chambers, she avoided mirrors, for reflections brought glimpses of the spirits that danced in the liminal spaces between life and death, reminders of the children who had been claimed by Bridget's forces. Even in the solitude of her grief, she could not escape their presence, a testament to the fact that the campaign of spiritual retribution was no longer bound by the physical actions of the living. Jane Baptiste, once confident in the power of wealth and social influence, had grown increasingly erratic. The plantation, once the crown jewel of the Delta, now operated under a weight of invisible pressure. His attempts at conventional remedies, consulting doctors, negotiating with ministers, and attempting agricultural interventions, proved futile. Each initiative that might have restored normalcy collapsed under circumstances that defied natural explanation. Livestock perished unexpectedly. Sugarcane rotted despite expert cultivation, and children under his care exhibited behaviors that could not be rationalized by science or theology. His nights were haunted by phantoms, spectral children who whispered truths, recited forgotten languages, and carried the palpable authority of generations wrong. Sleep became impossible, and even waking life blurred with visions that reminded him of a justice he could neither negotiate with nor appeal against. Breguet, in contrast, moved through this unfolding scene with meticulous precision. Her garden, cultivated with herbs and plants that obeyed spiritual rather than natural laws, had become a locus of power. Soil infused with graveyard dust and ancestral energy responded to her touch, growing medicinal and magical flora according to the exact needs of her campaigns. Every intervention she undertook, whether it appeared as healing or harm, was calibrated to preserve the operation of cosmic law, rather than mere temporal outcomes. The enslaved community that interacted with her understood these subtle dynamics. Aid came, but it was intertwined with lessons in patience, humility, and awareness that actions carried consequences far beyond the immediate moment. Meanwhile, the children of Belle Reverence continued their spectral duties, bridging the liminal divide between living and dead. Dreams filled with circles of dancing figures, lights untraceable to earthly sources, and whispers in ancient African tongues became routine experiences for both enslaved children and the descendants of the Tobido family. These interactions, seemingly supernatural, served as training and indoctrination for the spiritual army Breguet had conscripted, an army whose influence extended across generations and whose presence enforced justice without direct human supervision. Even as the living continued their daily routines, they were subject to influences that reminded them that moral and cosmic balances were being recalibrated in ways imperceptible to those who relied solely on empirical observation. By the end of the winter, Belle Rev's physical structures reflected the slow, inexorable force of spiritual intervention. The plantation house sagged, floors warped and columns fractured under pressure both visible and invisible. Soil became unresponsive to standard cultivation techniques, crops withering in patterns that mirrored the ethical decay of the Tobido lineage rather than environmental deficiency. Livestock perished without disease. Children exhibited unexplainable behavior, and any outsider attempting to engage in ordinary business or domestic affairs found themselves thwarted in ways they could neither rationalize nor anticipate. The land itself, suffused with the weight of historical wrongs, served as both a reminder and a mechanism through which Breguet's spiritual law operated independently of her direct actions. Celestine, aware of the ongoing activity yet powerless to intervene, grew increasingly introspective. The ghostly children that had once appeared in mirrors, hallways, and reflections of water now formed an omnipresent chorus, a constant accompaniment to her diminished life. Conversations in muted voices, teachings in languages unknown yet perfectly understood, and glimpses of justice enacted beyond her comprehension became the fabric of her daily existence. Though she remained alive, each moment underscored the reality that human understanding was insufficient to grapple with the cosmic forces now mobilized against the Toledo family. Bragget, standing in the Bayou's heart during dawns and dusks alike, remained the unwavering conductor of this unseen symphony. Time and physical distance no longer constrained her influence. Through her grief transformed into deliberate purpose, she had become a fulcrum upon which the justice owed to generations of wronged children was balanced. Belle Reve was no longer simply a plantation. It was a testament, a living archive of punishment and consequence enacted through spiritual agency rather than mortal governance. Her legacy, already etched into the land, the bloodline, and the liminal spaces of reality, ensured that no measure of wealth, position, or human intervention could undo the equilibrium she had imposed. As the winter gave way to spring, the subtle but relentless operations of Bragget's spiritual warfare continued, demonstrating that the moral universe, when activated by the willing and the knowledgeable, could operate beyond human comprehension or control. Every event at Belle Reve, from the withering of crops to the whispers of children in dreams, confirmed that the mechanisms of justice, though invisible, were as inexorable as time itself. Spring of 1856 arrived at Belle Reve not with renewal, but with a subtle intensification of the plantation's cursed atmosphere. The sun, when it pierced through the fog, seemed unable to warm anything fully, bathing the decaying sugarcane fields in a light that felt distant and insincere. The air smelled of damp earth and the faint metallic tang of stagnant water, carrying with it the echoes of grief and spiritual unrest. The enslaved workers, long familiar with Bragget's influence, moved through the fields with a watchful wariness, instinctively recognizing signs that something was not merely amiss but actively hostile to the lives and plans of the white family. Every crack in the soil, every sudden death among the livestock, every failure of irrigation was now read not as an accident, but as a deliberate manifestation of cosmic balance enforced through unseen forces. Celestine's health continued its decline, compounded by the knowledge that the curses she had once dismissed as rumor were rooted in realities she could neither understand nor resist. Her movements had become labored, her body perpetually swollen from fluid retention caused by repeated pregnancies, her face etched with a despair that reflected not only the loss of her children, but the ongoing and tangible assault on her family's legacy. Nightmares persisted, each more vivid and cruel than the last, featuring her unborn children being sold, stolen, or vanishing into the shadows, reminders that Bragget's vengeance was patient, methodical, and exacting. Even during waking hours, she experienced moments where she felt the brush of spectral hands, the whisper of tiny voices in corridors that had long been abandoned by life, and the occasional shimmer of movements just beyond her vision. These manifestations, undeniable to her, confirmed that the spiritual threads woven into the plantation and the bloodline were now operating independently of direct mortal action. Jean-Baptiste's desperation had reached its apex. The rational avenues through which he had sought remedy, physicians from New Orleans, ministers, alternative healers, had proven powerless. Each failure left him more hollow, more frantic, and more receptive to the subtle manifestations of forces he could neither see fully nor comprehend. He began to notice patterns, the manner in which the children in the household fell ill during lunar phases, the way crops failed in rhythms that did not align with known agricultural logic, and the unexplainable disruptions that befell visitors or workers who attempted to challenge the plantation's authority. Each incident chipped away at his confidence in his own capacity to maintain control, leaving him vulnerable to despair in ways Bragget had anticipated and cultivated through her meticulous planning. Meanwhile, Bragget continued to consolidate her spiritual influence. The Bayou and cypress groves near Belle Reve became natural conduits for ancestral power. Spanish moss hung thick, filtering moonlight into patterns that acted as guides or signals for spirits who now moved according to her intentions. Each plant in her garden, cultivated over years of ritual and care, responded to her touch and command, producing effects that no conventional medicine or magic could replicate. Herbs that could heal or harm, seeds that grew in alignment with spiritual intention rather than soil quality, and roots that carried ancestral memory were all arranged precisely to maximize her control over the spiritual landscape. The enslaved community recognized these tools as instruments of justice, channels through which the grievances of countless generations could manifest as tangible consequences for those who had perpetrated and benefited from oppression. The children of Belrev, many already dead but conscripted into Bragit's spiritual army, were increasingly visible to those with sensitivity to the liminal realm. Dreams became lessons, apparitions became warnings, and glimpses in reflective surfaces became instructions for navigating the complex web of cosmic justice. Their presence was disciplined and purposeful, not chaotic. They acted as enforcers of principles that human courts had ignored, delivering consequences according to patterns of morality and ancestral law rather than social convention. These spectral children ensured that no attempt by the living Tobido family to assert control or evade responsibility went unchallenged, reinforcing the permanence and inevitability of Bragit's work. By mid-spring, the plantation itself appeared to participate actively in the spiritual warfare. The soil resisted cultivation, crops withered unpredictably, and even structures seemed to groan and warp under pressures invisible to conventional understanding. Servants and workers reported sudden chills, voices that came from empty rooms, and fleeting shadows that seemed to monitor and respond to human activity. Any attempt at conventional correction, planting anew, repairing buildings, or addressing livestock issues was met with failure. This reinforced the lesson that the universe, when guided by ancestral and spiritual knowledge, could enforce justice in ways entirely beyond human authority or understanding. Celestine, witnessing the continued degradation of her home and lineage, sank deeper into isolation. She covered mirrors, avoided water reflections, and spent long hours in the company of the spirits she could perceive. Her grief and terror, while consuming, were also formative. She came to recognize that human effort alone could not counter the forces Bragit commanded. Each hour of despair, each trembling heartbeat, further aligned her life with the broader patterns of justice that had begun to define Belrev, establishing her as both victim and witness to a spiritual transformation that eclipsed mortal comprehension. Bragit, observing from her stations along the Bayou, remained the unwavering focal point of this orchestration. Her presence alone ensured that the forces she had summoned and disciplined continued to function in accordance with her precise intentions. The ritual threads connecting her to the Tobido bloodline and the land itself had matured into a complex network of influence, spanning generations and rendering human intervention powerless. Her grief, her discipline, and her inherited wisdom had fused to create a system in which morality and consequence were enforced not by law or human hands, but by the deliberate mechanisms of cosmic justice, executed with meticulous care and unyielding purpose. As spring deepened, Belrev stood as a monument to the consequences of systemic cruelty. The plantation's physical decline, the deteriorating health of its last remaining family members, and the increasingly visible operations of spiritual law all served as undeniable evidence that the forces Bragit had unleashed were not temporary or localized. They were enduring, systematic, and exacting, ensuring that every attempt to subvert justice would fail, and that the lessons of centuries of oppression would resonate through time in ways that human understanding could neither predict nor control. Summer of 1856 descended upon Belrev with an oppressive heaviness that seemed less like heat and more like the weight of anticipation. The sugarcane fields, once thriving under meticulous cultivation, now bore the marks of neglect and spiritual interference. Their once straight rows twisted and fragmented, as if the earth itself were rebelling against its caretakers. The air vibrated with a subtle energy that humans could sense but not name, an invisible pulse that seemed to carry messages from the spirits Bragit had conscripted. It was as if the plantation itself had become a living witness, recording every act of cruelty and storing it as fuel for the cosmic mechanisms Bragit had set in motion. Celestine's presence in the household had grown almost spectral. She moved slowly, burdened by her physical deterioration and the psychological toll of repeated pregnancy losses, each one a tangible reminder of the ongoing spiritual assault. Her eyes, once vibrant, now carried the dull sheen of someone who had witnessed forces beyond mortal comprehension. She often sat in the dim light of her room, listening to faint whispers, glimpsing the shadows of children who had never survived their infancy, and feeling the persistent tug of unseen hands that reminded her that Bragit's influence had extended far beyond her immediate perception. Even her servants, the few who remained, sensed her haunted state and tread carefully, understanding that her body and mind were now entwined with consequences far greater than any personal vendetta could explain. Jean-Baptiste, meanwhile, became increasingly erratic. His rational mind strained against the unexplainable occurrences that defied logic at every turn. Meetings with distant relatives, attempts to organize plantation management, and consultations with outside physicians all ended in frustration. Unfamiliar illnesses struck workers, livestock perished, and crops failed without cause, forcing him into a spiral of desperation. He began to notice subtle cues, the glimmer of reflections in mirrors, the strange alignment of shadows at twilight, and the pattern of unexplained misfortunes that he could no longer dismiss as coincidence. Though he remained proud and defiant in public, privately he began to entertain the unthinkable, that Braggett's work had fundamentally altered the natural order in ways that no amount of wealth, authority, or cunning could reverse. The enslaved community observed these shifts with a mixture of reverence and cautious optimism. They saw in Braggett's continued interventions a form of justice that had long been denied by the world of men. Her mastery of spiritual channels, honed over decades of ancestral study and ritual practice, had created an infrastructure through which suffering could be measured and repaid across generations. The spirits of deceased children, previously silent witnesses, were now active participants, their movements coordinated with Braggett's intentions. Dreams became instructional, apparitions were protective yet punitive, and subtle environmental changes, such as water currents in the Bayou and the growth patterns of vegetation, served as indicators of cosmic balance being restored. The enslaved understood that this was not mere superstition. It was an operational system of justice beyond the reach of human authority, where moral debt demanded acknowledgement and repayment. In the household, these forces manifested more tangibly. Mirrors cracked without physical cause, and sudden temperature drops occurred in specific rooms, often coinciding with periods of heightened activity among the children who survived the family's ongoing reproductive tragedies. Objects moved subtly, and voices, sometimes human, sometimes otherworldly, echoed through hallways, prompting fear and reflection among the remaining family members. Each manifestation was calculated, reinforcing the psychological and spiritual domination Braggett had achieved over the Toledo lineage. It was not enough to merely punish. The intention was to educate through consequence, ensuring that the lessons of moral transgression were deeply internalized and impossible to ignore. Braggett herself operated as both conductor and participant in this unfolding drama. Her garden had become a nexus of power, where herbs and plants grew in accordance with spiritual intention rather than natural law. She moved among them with deliberate precision, harvesting and arranging elements that would maximize her influence. Each ritual, whether performed openly in the Bayou or in secrecy within her sanctuary, served multiple purposes. It reinforced her control over the spirits, strengthened her connection to ancestral knowledge, and ensured that the mechanisms of cosmic justice continued to operate without disruption. The spirits themselves, bound to the purpose of righting historical wrongs, were disciplined, their energy channeled to achieve maximum impact on the descendants of those who had perpetrated or profited from generational oppression. By midsummer, the plantation's physical decline was unmistakable. Fields refused to yield crops despite expert attention. Structures leaned and groaned under their own weight, and water sources became unreliable, their clarity disturbed by the ethereal currents Braggett had established. Servants and workers reported auditory hallucinations, shadows behaving independently, and subtle touches that left them unsettled yet unharmed. Even those who attempted to rationalize these phenomena struggled to maintain conviction in the face of repeated, demonstrable disruptions. Belle Reve was no longer merely a plantation. It had become a living, reactive entity, shaped by ancestral forces and guided by the will of a single, determined mourner whose grief had transformed into power. Celestine's understanding of these events, however limited, evolved. She recognized that human authority, legal, economic, or social, was powerless against the structures Braggett had established. Every effort to restore control, every attempt to protect her remaining family, collided with invisible but immutable forces. Her anguish was both personal and symbolic. She represented a generation caught in the throes of consequences that transcended her comprehension. Yet even in despair, her suffering validated Braggett's methodology. Grief transformed into deliberate action could override conventional notions of power and control, demonstrating the effectiveness of spiritual justice over material authority. As summer waned, it became increasingly evident that Belrave's trajectory was irreversible. The plantation's decline, the persistent presence of child spirits, and the unbroken chain of supernatural intervention ensured that the Tobito family's suffering would continue, shaped by principles of justice rather than chance. Braggett's work had matured into a fully functional system, and every member of the household was now subject to its rules. Her transformation from healer to cosmic executor had reached new heights. She no longer merely reacted to injustice, but orchestrated it with precision, ensuring that consequences would extend beyond human perception and endure long after the immediate actors had passed from the world. By the fall of 1856, Belraven had entered a period of relentless decay that mirrored the spiritual collapse of its owners. The plantation house, once a proud emblem of Tobito wealth and social dominance, now sagged under the weight of years of neglect compounded by supernatural interference. Cracks ran along walls that had been plastered only a decade earlier, while the wooden floors warped, creaking under minimal pressure, as though the house itself was sighing in anticipation of the continuing consequences that Breggett's work would unleash. The cypress groves surrounding the property grew denser, their roots intruding into former fields and disrupting the orderly rows of sugarcane that had previously symbolized human dominion over nature. Shadows moved with independent consciousness, twisting and stretching with every passing hour, reminders to all who lived there or survived there that nothing would proceed according to conventional logic. Celestine's health continued its inexorable decline. Each pregnancy, following the pattern set by Breggett's initial interventions, carried increasing complications that no physician, regardless of training, could resolve. Her body, swollen and unstable, reflected a war between physicality and spiritual manipulation. She endured nausea and pain so profound that sleep became nearly impossible, while the faintest movements in her abdomen hinted at the invisible struggle between life and the malevolent spiritual forces Braggett had activated. Each kick of her unborn child seemed both a plea and a protest, a silent acknowledgement that existence itself was now contested ground. Celestine's understanding of her own body shifted from the physical to the spiritual, an awareness that she was a vessel entangled in forces orchestrated beyond the material world. Jean-Baptiste became increasingly unhinged as events accelerated. His efforts to restore the plantation through conventional means, hiring new overseers, purchasing replacement livestock, attempting to rebuild failing infrastructure, were consistently thwarted. Crops rotted in the fields despite ideal conditions, and animals were found dead, sometimes violently contorted in ways that suggested struggle against unseen assailants. His mental state deteriorated under the compounded pressure of repeated failure, and the persistent realization that human power was irrelevant in the face of Breggett's spiritual mechanisms. Nights brought hallucinations, or perhaps visions, of children who had died under his family's authority. Their eyes, wide and accusing, haunted his dreams. Their tiny hands seemed to reach across time, grasping for justice. In moments of lucidity, he would consult the few remaining witnesses to these phenomena, seeking logical explanations that never came. Each denial of reality only strengthened the psychic hold that Breguet had imposed over Belrev, the enslaved population, increasingly attuned to the spiritual dynamics at work, began to act as both observers and subtle participants in the unfolding cosmic justice. Stories circulated of the ghostly children who wandered through the swampy undergrowth at night, their laughter carrying both warning and reassurance. Dreams became a conduit for ancestral communication, providing guidance and caution to those who remained. These interactions were never direct acts of revenge. They were lessons encoded in the spiritual fabric of Belrev, ensuring that those capable of perceiving justice could navigate it wisely while the oppressors remained unaware or impotent. The spirits were disciplined, their energies orchestrated by Breguet to maximize their impact on those who had inflicted suffering, while minimizing collateral disruption to the enslaved community they protected. Breguet herself moved through this transformed landscape with the serene authority of someone who had fully transcended ordinary mortality. Her garden, now a supernatural arsenal, thrived under conditions invisible to conventional understanding. Plants reacted to thought and intention, petals arranged themselves in patterns dictated by ancestral design, and herbs displayed healing or harmful properties according to ritualized instructions rather than soil chemistry. Each interaction with her environment reinforced her dual role as caretaker and executor of cosmic law. She rarely entered the plantation house itself, preferring the Bayou's natural cathedral spaces, where moonlight filtered through Spanish moss like divine signals. There she prepared ingredients and invoked spirits, performing rituals that ensured the spiritual mechanisms she had established would operate independently of her physical presence. The ritual patterns initiated in 1854 had reached a point of full integration into Belle Rêve's ecosystem. Every physical failure, every unexpected death, every psychological fracture experienced by the Tobido family was now a predictable output of spiritual intervention. Yet these outcomes were never cruel for cruelty's sake. They adhered to precise principles of cosmic justice, each misfortune measured against historical transgressions inflicted upon enslaved generations. Even the patterns of disease, decay, and disaster carried a rhythm, a consistency that signaled order within the chaos. The plantation was alive, not as a home or source of profit, but as a living instrument of moral correction, a mechanism through which Brigitte's grief and mastery could deliver multi-generational justice. By late October, the environment itself responded to Brigitte's ongoing influence. Mists rose unnaturally early, carrying faint whispers and glimpses of children's forms between the cypress trees. Waterways glowed faintly with phosphorescence at night, signaling the presence of spiritual forces ready to intervene. Livestock behavior became increasingly erratic, as if animals were attuned to disturbances imperceptible to the human mind. Jean-Baptiste's desperation escalated alongside these changes, his efforts increasingly frantic and poorly coordinated. Each failure reinforced the inevitability of Belle Rêve's trajectory. The plantation's decline was irreversible, a testament to the precision and inevitability of spiritual law. Celestine, though diminished physically, began to internalize a broader understanding of the forces at play. She recognized that the patterns affecting her body, her family, and the land were connected, forming a network of cause and consequence extending beyond immediate perception. Though the knowledge brought her no relief, it offered perspective. The suffering of the Tobido line was now a complex system operating according to immutable principles. In this, she became an indirect witness to the success of Brigitte's design. Grief, transformed into power, had rewritten the rules of human agency, ensuring that moral debt would be enforced across generations without exception. By the winter of 1856, Belle Rêve had become a shadow of its former self, its decay as inevitable as the spiritual consequences that Brigitte's interventions had set in motion. The main house sagged under the weight of time and unseen forces, the foundations cracking along invisible fault lines, as though the very land recognized the injustice upon which the Tobido legacy had been built. Windows, once polished to a high gloss, now bore streaks of mildew, while mirrors reflected fragmented images of the house's deteriorating interior, occasionally catching shadows that did not belong to any living being. The cypress groves had thickened into labyrinthine barriers, their roots and tangled undergrowth overtaking once productive fields, as if the earth itself had joined Brigitte in her campaign of cosmic correction. In the distance, Spanish moss swayed in slow, deliberate patterns, filtering moonlight into designs that could only be read by those with the sight to perceive the invisible currents flowing across the plantation. Celestine's condition continued its inexorable decline. Each successive pregnancy brought complications that no medical intervention could remedy. Her body, swollen beyond natural measure, was a battleground between physical vulnerability and spiritual warfare. Nausea and persistent pain eroded her strength, while the faintest movements within her womb suggested a struggle between life and supernatural opposition. These sensations were neither imagined nor metaphorical. They were the manifestation of Brigitte's carefully orchestrated intervention, designed to impose justice through the most intimate and devastating of channels. The unborn children seemed to react to forces invisible to physicians, their growth stunted or altered, as though caught in a tug-of-war between maternal instinct and ancestral will. Jean-Baptiste, meanwhile, teetered on the brink of madness. His repeated attempts to restore order, employing overseers, consulting doctors, and investing in new livestock, were met with relentless failure. Fields that should have yielded crops rotted inexplicably. Animals were found dead in contorted postures, their struggles suggesting an unseen hand had intervened. Nightmares plagued him with images of the children who had perished under his family's rule, their voices whispering across the plantation with languages lost to European memory but fully intelligible in spirit. In waking hours, he glimpsed movements in peripheral vision, shadows that behaved as if guided by purpose, leaving him uncertain whether he was awake or trapped in some liminal space between worlds. Rationality became a fragile veneer, cracking under the weight of events that obeyed cosmic rather than human law. The enslaved community observed these developments with a mixture of fear and reverence. Their understanding of Broggitt's work extended beyond the superficial. They saw patterns of spiritual influence shaping the plantation, enforcing justice with precision. Dreams became conduits of communication. Visions of children dancing among the cypress groves conveyed warnings, guidance, and reassurance. These spirits acted neither for vengeance nor malice toward the oppressed. They served justice. The enslaved people learned to navigate this spiritual ecosystem, interpreting signs that guided their survival while remaining invisible to the Tobidos, who had no understanding of the moral frameworks governing these interventions. Broggitt herself moved through the landscape like a figure of inevitability, her physical presence interwoven with the spiritual currents she commanded. Her garden had transformed into a locus of mystical potency, where herbs and plants responded to intention rather than cultivation. Each step she took seemed to ripple through the fabric of reality. She rarely needed to enter the main house. The instruments of her justice, spirits, sacred objects, and carefully timed rituals acted independently, ensuring that the consequences of Tobido cruelty unfolded precisely according to her design. Her interactions with the remaining enslaved community were measured, each act reinforcing the duality of her role as protector and executor of ancestral law. By early 1857, the spiritual dynamics at Belle Reve reached a point of seamless integration. Every crop failure, livestock death, and psychological fracture was now part of a coherent system, the outputs of spiritual law interacting with the material world. Misfortunes were not random. They adhered to strict principles of cosmic justice. The plantation itself had become an instrument of moral correction, the land, house, and inhabitants all bound to the enforcement of debts accumulated across generations. The invisible children, once victims, now served as agents of justice, their energy directed with purpose, ensuring that the suffering once inflicted upon them would echo through the Tobido lineage indefinitely. Celestine, frail yet perceptive, gradually understood the larger pattern. She recognized that her own suffering, her body, and the land were interconnected in a network of cause and effect, orchestrated by forces beyond ordinary comprehension. Though this awareness brought no relief, it provided clarity. The systematic decline of the Tobido family and the plantation's decay were not arbitrary. They were the material manifestations of Broggitt's spiritual engineering. In witnessing these processes, Celestine became a reluctant chronicler, an observer of justice enacted on scales both personal and generational. Her role was passive but essential, the human witness to the mechanisms of grief transformed into cosmic power. The environmental shifts were increasingly dramatic. Early mists rose with unnatural consistency, carrying whispers of children's voices. Shadows moved independently, and Bayou waters glowed faintly under moonlight, signaling spiritual presence. Even minor disturbances, broken furniture, cracked mirrors, or sudden cold spots, were understood as extensions of Broggitt's work. Evidence that her influence reached into every corner of Belle Reve. Jean-Baptiste's desperation intensified as he witnessed these events, confirming to all, with eyes to see, that nothing could halt the systematic enforcement of justice woven into the plantation's very foundation. The spring of 1857 arrived at Belle Reve in a deceptive calm, masking the ongoing spiritual turmoil beneath its moss-draped canopy. Sunlight filtered weakly through the thick cypress groves, and the air carried the faint but persistent scent of decay, the plantation's physical deterioration now an inseparable part of its atmosphere. Celestine, weakened by repeated pregnancies and the cumulative toll of Broggitt's interventions, moved through her days with a fragile awareness of the forces at work. Every sound, every shadow, and every subtle shift in temperature reminded her that the plantation was no longer governed by human logic or conventional authority, but by the meticulous enforcement of cosmic justice. The enslaved community, meanwhile, adapted to the evolving spiritual ecology. Those with sight beyond the ordinary observed the spirit's activities. Children who had perished under Tobido oppression now guided the living, teaching lessons of vigilance, caution, and moral memory. The spirits manifested at precise times, often during pre-dawn hours, marking moments when natural laws bent to the requirements of justice. Their presence was subtle yet undeniable, a faint glow in the bayou, the sound of laughter that carried both joy and warning, and the sensation of unseen hands guiding the labor of the living. To the enslaved, these signals confirmed that their suffering had been recognized and that a force greater than human cruelty operated in their favor, enforcing a balance long denied by white authority. Jean-Baptiste, increasingly unmoored from reality, oscillated between frantic rationality and outright terror. His calculations about crop cycles and livestock management were rendered meaningless as failures persisted despite the application of advanced techniques and imported expertise. He consulted physicians from New Orleans, only to confront their impotence against phenomena they could neither measure nor explain. Ministers offered prayers that temporarily eased his anxiety, but could not alter the spiritual laws Braguet had set in motion. Even the intervention of practitioners who claimed mastery over African traditions proved inadequate. Their rituals lacked the precision and ancestral authority Braguet wielded. The plantation was now a theater in which every event, material or supernatural, testified to the inevitable consequences of generations of systemic oppression. Celestine's latest pregnancy progressed with the same ominous patterns as those before it. Her abdomen swelled unnaturally, yet the baby's movements remained faint and irregular. Medical examinations suggested fragility, but her instincts, trained by suffering and observation, told her that something beyond biology was at work. She occasionally sensed hostile movements within her womb, the presence of spirits intertwined with the child's development, ensuring that each birth would serve as a testament to ancestral justice. Braguet's methods, though invisible and impenetrable to conventional medicine, had achieved what they were intended to, a systematic enforcement of moral balance that left no avenue for the Thibodeau family to escape. By midsummer, the consequences of Braguet's work became increasingly visible. Crops that had appeared promising succumbed overnight to rot. The stalks blackened and brittle under the slightest touch. Livestock perished without signs of disease or injury, their deaths appearing almost ritualistic in their timing and circumstances. Even the natural environment seemed to obey spiritual imperatives. The bayou's waters glimmered with otherworldly luminescence, carrying the echoes of children's voices across its reflective surface, while the cypress trees' roots constricted pathways, guiding both the living and the spectral inhabitants along channels predetermined by justice. The plantation's white overseers struggled to comprehend these patterns. Their punishments and incentives were irrelevant. They operated under assumptions of cause and effect that no longer apply. Attempts to restore order through human control only reinforced the power of Braguet's interventions, as every effort to assert dominion over land, labor, or livestock became entangled in spiritual currents beyond their perception. The invisible army of ancestral spirits responded to each action, adjusting outcomes to maintain the balance of cosmic debt and ensure that every misdeed accumulated over generations received corresponding consequence. Celestine, increasingly frail, found herself drawn to Braguet for guidance, even in private. Though physically weaker, her mind became a vessel for understanding the scope and mechanics of the spiritual forces at work. Braguet taught her to read subtle signs, interpret the rhythms of spirit activity, and recognize moments when ancestral energy converged with the material world. Celestine's comprehension was incomplete, yet it offered her the sense that she could bear witness to the orchestration of justice, validating her suffering as part of a far-reaching moral design. As summer waned, whispers of change spread throughout the plantation. Even Jean-Baptiste could no longer dismiss the unnatural patterns, observing with growing dread that every attempt at normalcy, births, harvests, livestock management, was systematically subverted. Celestine's pregnancy reached a critical stage, the unborn child exhibiting movements influenced by forces beyond comprehension. Braguet's spells, woven with ancestral precision, ensured that each generation of the Thibodeau family remained entwined with consequences they could not avoid. Every human effort to circumvent or ignore these outcomes was nullified by the careful orchestration of spiritual law, executed through Braguet's ritual expertise, and the moral authority conferred by her ancestors. By the first frost of 1857, Belle Reverend solidified as a locus where spiritual justice was tangible. Shadows, light, temperature, and sound operated according to the principles of cosmic balance, rather than conventional understanding. The plantation's decay mirrored the ethical decay of the family it had sustained, while the enslaved community, guided by ancestral spirits, navigated their existence with awareness of forces invisible yet powerfully real. Bridget had transformed Belle Reverend, both a classroom and a tribunal, demonstrating that no accumulation of wealth or authority could defy moral law, and that those who exploited others would ultimately face consequences dictated by forces far greater than human comprehension. The autumn of 1857 brought with it a restless energy that seemed to stir both the living and the dead across Belle Reverend. Spanish moss shivered in the early winds, and the cypress groves whispered secrets to those who listened with the right eyes. Celestine, now hollowed by repeated losses and the weight of her own fragile mortality, felt the persistent presence of ancestral justice pressing upon every aspect of her existence. She moved slowly through the plantation, her shadow stretching long and uncertain across the cracked floors of the once grand house. The walls, thick with the history of exploitation and grief, seemed to pulse with memories of pain. Each step she took reverberating against echoes of children long gone, but now conscripted into Bridget's army of spiritual enforcers. Bridget's influence over the spiritual topography of Belle Rev had reached its peak. No corner of the plantation was untouched by her orchestration. Every shadow, every reflection, every faint shimmer of moonlight served as a conduit for her intent. She moved silently among the cypress, her hands brushing against sacred plants that had absorbed decades of ritual energy. Each herb, each root, and each blade of grass had been cultivated, not merely for healing but for enforcement, ensuring that any attempt to defy the plantation's moral reckoning would meet resistance both subtle and devastating. The enslaved community, already attuned to the spirit's presence, found themselves guided by unseen forces in ways that enhanced survival and understanding, as the landscape itself became a living map of ancestral authority. Celestine's latest pregnancy progressed with the same ominous patterns that had marked her previous experiences. Her body, swollen yet weak, bore witness to forces operating in defiance of ordinary biology. The unborn child moved with hesitation, and often with resistance, as if sensing the spiritual conflict surrounding its development. Occasionally, Celestine felt a cold alien presence within her womb, a spectral hand guiding the process, ensuring that her suffering contributed to a larger moral balance rather than merely her own private torment. Her interactions with physicians and midwives had become perfunctory. They could offer no remedy for the cosmic mechanics unfolding within her, and indeed any intervention they attempted seemed absorbed or redirected by forces beyond their understanding. Meanwhile, Jean-Baptiste's despair deepened. The plantation, already a shadow of its former self, now resisted even his most calculated measures of control. Crops failed at the peak of growth. Livestock died without pattern or disease, and the once orderly corridors of the house echoed with invisible footsteps. Each night, the sounds of children crying, laughing, and whispering through walls reminded him that the debt of generations could not be paid with wealth or authority alone. Sleep became impossible. The boundary between waking and dreaming blurred, as spectral presences claimed dominion over every hour of the day and night. His hands trembled over letters and account books. Unable to assert mastery over a reality dictated by principles he could neither perceive nor challenge. Bridget, ever vigilant, observed all this with quiet precision. Her rituals had become second nature, a seamless integration of inherited wisdom and experiential mastery. She moved through the Bayou and Plantation with the awareness that every action, no matter how small, carried consequences that would ripple across decades. The spectral children responded to her presence, aligning their energies to enforce justice with increasing sophistication. Those with eyes attuned to spiritual realities noted that she no longer moved as a single human being, but as an intersection of living intent and ancestral will, a conduit for forces that were both protective and punitive. Celestine, increasingly drawn into this web of spiritual enforcement, began to understand her role in the larger moral framework. Her pregnancies, once private matters of family continuity, now became instruments of cosmic law. Every contraction, every moment of discomfort, every episode of illness was woven into a grander scheme designed to exact justice from a lineage built upon suffering and exploitation. Though physically weakened, she bore witness to the ways Bridget's interventions reshaped time, space, and consequence on Belle Rev. As the first frost hardened the soil in late November, the plantation entered a period of heightened spiritual activity. Manifestations became more pronounced. Mirrors cracked spontaneously, reflecting not only the room but the presence of spirits unseen. The bayou glowed with unearthly luminescence, as spectral children gathered in silent council, and winds carried whispers that conveyed warnings, encouragements, and historical accounts too old for living memory. Every day, Celestine felt these forces pressing closer, as though her own body were a bridge between the living and the dead. Jean-Baptiste's desperation grew as the temporal and spiritual worlds collided in ways he could not comprehend. Even the interventions of distant relatives and expert consultants proved futile. Every act of control he attempted was neutralized or redirected by the invisible army enforcing Brigiette's will. Belreve had become a testament to the principle that human power, when wielded through oppression, was ultimately subordinate to cosmic law. Every failure reinforced the reality that no wealth, no rank, and no intellectual acumen could escape the mechanisms of justice rooted in ancestral memory and spiritual consequence. By winter's onset, the plantation had transformed fully into a site of moral reckoning. The enslaved, guided by ancestral spirits, navigated life with heightened perception and awareness of justice in motion. Celestine, weakened but increasingly conscious of the forces shaping her fate, moved as both participant and witness, recognizing that the spiritual war enacted upon Belreve had far-reaching implications for all future generations of the Tobido bloodline. Brigitte, the Mourning Priestess, had elevated grief into power, ensuring that cosmic balance would operate relentlessly across time, space, and lineage. The early months of 1858 brought a brittle quiet to Belreve, a deceptive calm that belied the profound spiritual currents shaping every corner of the plantation. Snowless frost crept into low-lying areas of the bayou, turning mud into a thin sheet of glass and giving the impression that even the landscape itself had paused in anxious anticipation. Celestine, now further worn by the cumulative effects of her previous pregnancies, moved with a measured gait through the house. Her steps echoed off walls lined with portraits of ancestors whose achievements had long been shadowed by systemic exploitation. Every painting, every gilded frame seemed to pulse with awareness, as if the spirits that now dominated Belreve had found recognition even in the symbols of human pride and authority. The latest pregnancy progressed with increasingly erratic manifestations. The child within her grew unevenly, sometimes silent for hours, and at other times thrashing against forces invisible to those around her. Celestine's nights were filled with feverish dreams that replayed the horrors of the past decades. The auctions, the screams, the hands of Brigitte guiding justice in ways that left no human recourse. On several occasions, she awoke drenched in sweat, her hands clutching her swollen abdomen, certain that the spirit army was near, checking that the cosmic balance continued to tilt in favor of those wronged by the Tobido line. The sensations were so vivid that physical symptoms, nausea, fatigue, sharp pains, followed immediately, reinforcing the connection between the spiritual and corporeal realms. Brigitte, ever watchful, continued to refine her rituals. She spent hours in the cypress groves during dawn, inscribing protective wards in the soil with white cornmeal and ancestral dust. The combination of ritual precision and innate spiritual knowledge created an environment in which each plant, each shadow, and each breeze carried the weight of ancestral judgment. Those with the ability to perceive these subtleties began to note changes in the behavior of the enslaved community. Children whispered of invisible companions with guidance and protection beyond ordinary human comprehension. Elders recognized shifts in natural cycles that reflected ancestral presence. Even the animals of the plantation seemed to move with newfound caution, sensing forces that had never existed before in the natural world. Jean-Baptiste's frustrations reached a breaking point. The material world, governed by cause and effect, was no longer sufficient to control outcomes. His authority, previously unchallenged in human terms, dissolved in the face of events that obeyed a different logic. Ancestral logic, cosmic justice enacted in ways imperceptible to human senses. Meetings with physicians, ministers, and consultants yielded nothing. Even the most rational explanations failed to account for nightly disturbances, spectral lights on the bayou, and the unexplainable decay of perfectly cultivated crops. Each failed attempt at intervention seemed orchestrated by a force outside his comprehension, one that ensured consequences matched the severity of historical transgressions. Celestine, increasingly aware of the intricate network of spiritual justice, began to internalize the roles of victim, witness, and instrument of cosmic law. Each episode of pain, each flutter of movement from her unborn child, was understood not as a personal misfortune, but as part of a broader moral narrative. The pregnancy became an arena in which ancestral power and historical memory clashed with human attempts to resist accountability. She could sense the subtle guidance of Braggett's interventions, herbs and treatments that offered relief, while preserving the necessary tension for spiritual correction. Every sensation, every fleeting hope, carried the weight of a lesson that wealth, privilege, and social authority could not negate. As February approached, Belle Rêve's supernatural environment intensified. The bayou waters shimmered with phosphorescent light during moonless nights, and the air itself seemed heavy with presences unseen. Mirrors reflected not only the living, but echoes of past tragedies, revealing children who had long since passed but now served as enforcers of justice. The plantation's once productive fields continued to fail in ways that confounded even the most meticulous planners. Livestock succumbed suddenly, and even seasoned caretakers whispered about movements in the shadows that no human could explain. Every disturbance reinforced the awareness that Belle Rêve had become an active participant in the enforcement of moral law, rather than a passive stage for human enterprise. Braggett, meanwhile, continued to engage the spiritual army she had conscripted. Nightly invocations grew in complexity, drawing on hidden African traditions, preserved in her memory and in the collective unconscious of the enslaved. She orchestrated rituals designed to ensure that no child of the Tobido line would reach maturity unchallenged by ancestral forces. Each working deepened the spiritual connections, tying the living Tobido descendants to the wronged spirits of Belle Rêve, reinforcing a pattern that would persist across generations. The Mourning Priestess operated with precision, every word, gesture, and chant acting as a vector for justice that transcended time, geography, and human comprehension. Celestine's labor began quietly at first, with subtle contractions and faint sensations of resistance from the womb. But as the hours passed, the intensity increased, each wave of pain underscored by the presence of the spiritual army enforcing Braggett's will. The child, Jean-Baptiste III, moved as though caught between worlds, alternately retreating and struggling forward. Celestine, aware of the cosmic mechanisms in motion, bore the anguish with a resigned clarity. This birth was not simply about life and death, but about the enforcement of a moral ledger that could not be ignored. By the time the child was born, it was clear that the spiritual forces had achieved precise execution. Jean-Baptiste III lived only briefly, baptized in the faint candlelight before passing into the realm where other wronged spirits waited. His life, though fleeting, fulfilled its purpose as a link in the ancestral chain, reinforcing the curse and ensuring the pattern of spiritual justice continued unbroken. Celestine, exhausted and grieving, understood that she had participated in the orchestration of a moral universe that operated independently of human desire, ambition, or wealth. The aftermath of Jean-Baptiste's brief life left Belle Rêve shrouded in a deeper, almost tangible tension. The plantation's corridors seemed to hold their breath, as if aware that another installment of ancestral justice had been executed. Celestine's body, weakened by repeated pregnancies and the spiritual strain imposed upon it, moved with deliberate care, each step a negotiation with forces that remained both intimate and incomprehensible. She no longer experienced grief in the ordinary sense. Her mourning had become an act of awareness, a conscious participation in the cosmic processes Braggett had set in motion. She could feel the spiritual threads connecting her own womb, the lives of her children, and the broader Tobido bloodline, each thread vibrating with the echoes of past transgressions and the expectations of justice yet to be exacted. Braggett observed quietly from the edges of the cypress groves. Her presence was no longer simply maternal or human. It had been transformed into something ineffable, a conduit for ancestral power that flowed through her as naturally as the Mississippi itself moved through the delta. Every ritual she had performed, every incantation whispered in the hidden chambers of Belle Rêve, had strengthened the invisible lattice connecting the living and the dead. Her role as Mourning Priestess allowed her to orchestrate consequences with precision, ensuring that the descendants of the Tobido line would remain inextricably bound to the moral reckoning demanded by centuries of oppression. Even subtle movements of her hands or slight inflections in her voice carried energy that could alter reality, a testament to the depth of her spiritual transformation. The enslaved community, intimately attuned to the shifts in spiritual currents, continued to navigate a world increasingly defined by unseen forces. Some were drawn to Braggett for guidance and protection, recognizing that her interventions, though terrifying to the uninitiated, represented the culmination of ancestral knowledge and moral authority. Others observed with cautious curiosity, aware that the power in motion at Belle Reverend operated independently of human understanding, aligning with principles that had existed long before the arrival of European settlers and would persist long after. Children in particular exhibited behaviors that confirmed the presence of ancestral spirits, whispering to empty corners, refusing to enter certain rooms at night, or inexplicably calming in the presence of forces invisible to the human eye. Meanwhile, Jean-Baptiste himself grew increasingly unmoored. The physical exertions of managing the plantation, coupled with the constant stress of unexplained phenomena, took a toll on his mental stability. He began to perceive connections where none should exist, noticing patterns in the decay of crops, the illness of livestock, and the behavior of his remaining children that seemed orchestrated rather than coincidental. Nights became sleepless as he wrestled with auditory hallucinations, voices calling names he recognized, sometimes softly, sometimes with chilling urgency. He confessed to his closest advisors that reality itself seemed uncertain, that boundaries between life and death, past and present, were dissolving before his eyes. Yet there was nothing he could do. Every conventional solution, from medical intervention to spiritual consultation with European-trained clergy, failed to halt the inexorable effects of Braguet's meticulously constructed network of justice. Spring brought no relief. The plantation, once a symbol of economic success, now resembled a landscape frozen in moral reckoning. Fields of sugarcane remained patchy and unproductive, with stalks blackening unpredictably, while the bayou reflected faint lights with no apparent source. Celestine, weakened but resolute, continued to move among the surviving plants, tending to herbs and carefully observing the subtle manifestations of spiritual interference. Each occurrence, from the gentle flutter of leaves in areas untouched by wind to the sudden appearance of reflective patterns in water, reinforced the understanding that her body, her children, and the land itself were part of a single intricate system of justice. As Braguet prepared for her next major working, the spiritual army she had conscripted continued to grow in potency and coordination. Children who had died under her influence now acted as emissaries, enforcing the decrees of cosmic justice in ways that extended beyond human comprehension. They intervened subtly in the lives of the Tobido lineage, ensuring that every misstep, every attempt at evasion, triggered consequences aligned with historical depth. Their presence was invisible to the untrained eye, yet undeniable in the patterns of misfortune that increasingly characterized Belle Rev. Every death, every failed crop, every unexplained illness reinforced the immutable law that Braguet had enacted. Injustice, no matter how delayed, would be accounted for in full. By the summer of 1858, the final generation of the Tobido line remaining on the plantation exhibited signs of profound disruption. Pregnancies were fraught with complication, children's health fragile, and the household atmosphere thick with unease. Celestine, intimately aware of the spiritual architecture surrounding her, served as both witness and participant, her understanding of justice extending beyond human emotion. She recognized that her suffering, though immense, was instrumental in maintaining the pattern that would ensure equilibrium across generations. Every physical ache, every sleepless night, every moment of despair reinforced the invisible architecture of ancestral judgment, reminding the family and the enslaved community alike that moral law was inexorable. Braguet, observing the culmination of decades of planning and ritual, allowed herself a moment of reflection. The Mourning Priestess had transformed grief into power, personal loss into a mechanism of cosmic equilibrium. The plantation itself, now a stage for ongoing spiritual enforcement, embodied the consequences of human exploitation and arrogance. Her interventions ensured that no generation of the Tobido family could escape the consequences of inherited cruelty, while simultaneously demonstrating the enduring resilience of ancestral knowledge and maternal power in a world that had long sought to suppress it.